What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for Your Overwatch, and I think it's been long enough that we finally can readdress power creep in the game of Overwatch. Last year, when I used to harp on this topic a lot, some Jedi mind tricks were attempted on the community with a hand wave saying there is no power creep here. The conversation was muddy then, but I think it's very clear now. But surprisingly, I have a very different opinion on what Blizzard can do and the effects of their decisions moving forward. So in this video, I want to try to discuss the benefits and trade-offs of the direction they're going and what further options they have to themselves. So first of all, what is power creep? A lot of people don't know. I think the evidence is just abundantly clear around us now. When you look at characters like Genji, who got all the stats all at once, or the recent experimental card to Moira, who Blizzard is playing around with giving the power of what I think could be an ultimate ability into her Fade cooldown, which already was a good cooldown as it was. This is what we mean. And for a much more discreet look at this, a few weeks ago, Surefour tweeted out a great example of power creep. He didn't call it this by name, but discussed the problem of effective healing in Overwatch, where at the launch of the game, healing was a very rare resource, the strongest of which, Mercy, required you to pick a single target to heal at a time, whereas the very forgiving, powerful healers like Brigitte, Baptiste, and Moira don't require that level of decision making, meaning that in order for DPS to have a chance to kill anything, they either had to play burst DPS or Blizzard has had to routinely buff and buff and buff DPS to deal with the amount of healing that exists. And that, simply put, is power creep, creating a feedback loop or a cycle. As you continue to make changes to try to improve the viability of one thing, well, everything has to gradually get better over time to compete with each other. Lucio is a character that really clearly has got destroyed by power creep, because when Blizzard designs to force up a pick like Genji, who felt unplayable against Brigitte before, to have the stats to be able to deal with Brigitte, when Genji goes up against a hero like Lucio, well, now Genji can easily wreck Lucio, where the duel is much more even before, and perhaps I might even say Lucio was favored in the duel originally, especially when Lucio got his DPS rework to be much more brawly. And the troubling thing with this is that by refusing to nerf Brig, they essentially make her more of a must pick, because now when you're going up against a Genji, he's designed to interact with Brig and have a chance against her. Well, if you pick anything that isn't Brig now, you're just asking to die easier to this new Genji, because power level is always comparative. It's the context of the options you have at the current time. So here's a question then. What does Blizzard do with these characters that I've highlighted that are perhaps really fun, balanced, fair, but now bad? Lucio and Hog are my favorite examples right now. They either can bring the power level of the game down to meet them, or they can try to do what I think is good power creep, okay? It's not always bad. In many ways, Blizzard has made this work. One way that I think they've done it effectively is the rework of Reinhardt, where they made him faster with his shield, lowered the shield health, but gave him Steadfast, breaking some of their original design principles where they don't want any ability overlap. Orisa was the character that had a button that stopped her from getting displaced. Well, now Reinhardt has a version of that. And with that, Rein, at least he feels like he can do his job. It's hard right now in the current meta, but for most levels of play, he functions. And the way they accomplished that was by adding what effectively is a type of interaction into the mix. Soft immunity to CC. And in a nutshell, that's what I think Blizzard has to do with Overwatch moving forward to properly balance it in this power-crept world. What I'm advocating for here is counterplay with the interactions of how heroes go at each other, not simply buffing stats, though sometimes that might be required, but it's the counter interactions that are important here. Radically putting stats up or down can often have adverse side effects at different tiers of play. My favorite example of this is where they tried to buff Reaper and Mei during the GOATS meta, and then Reaper was this unkillable nightmare machine at most other levels of play and kind of has retained some of that power since that era as well. I think Blizzard's created a different problem with Orisa Sigma in the other direction, where they're perceived to be a lot weaker at lower tiers now, where the barrier rework moved power away from their shields, which maybe you might call passive value. You lay them down and they absorb damage, to instead put power into their sustain cooldowns. At the average level of play, Orisa Sigma are much weaker as picks, largely due to this power shift, because if you can't aim well, you would have preferred your shield to be able to do the heavy lifting for your character, but now you have to land all your shots, which is one aspect of skill. But now when you maximize their sustained cooldowns, they're going to give you more effective health than the movement-based tanks. And when the stats go that lopsided, well, you can see why high-level players are just forced to mirror Sig Orisa almost every game now, which is cool in one way because they have cool plays to make. They're more fun to play now that barriers are worse. There's a lot of FPS going on from the tanks. Being such effective fighters kind of robs the tank category from the space creation and teamwork skill sets that used to be required of them. The punishing nature of understanding map control and, frankly, playing tank as a tank rather than a DPS with a light shield, well, that's kind of gone now, at least for higher tiers. And that's a little bit more sleeper. You win basically because you have cooldowns to let you survive rather than expertly weaving in and out of your Winston bubble or managing your Rhine shield to get space and path in the right direction. A lot of that movement sustain that those tanks had to use is being trumped by Orisa and Sigma just having buttons to press. But this is a key problem for me with Blizzard's design right now, where other games are fine if easier characters are better at lower tiers of play. It seems like Blizzard is dead set on making every character viable at all tiers all the time, and that's just not a thing that happens in any game I've ever seen, right? Like, I think the Moira Team Wraithform Fade ability is an example of this, where they're taking one of the easiest characters in the game and trying to give them a button to push that somehow compares to the best value of the hardest characters in the game. I'm okay with it in principle, but it's confusing as who is this character made for? So going back to my previous examples and perhaps providing some suggestions for how to effectively power creep some of these other characters. Like one character you can look to, Roadhog, he has a problem of just being so painfully average at everything he does. Take a Breather is an incredibly fair ability that has a lot of interactions that can beat it, so it never feels oppressive. It's the opposite of Orisa Fortify, but yet Orisa does so much more for the team. This might sound silly, but it would make sense if those abilities were flipped. If you're expecting that slot of the team to provide a similar level of tanking power. As is, Roadhog can't really brawl on the point for you. He's really bad at that. The only way he gets away at point presence is if the enemy don't use one of the dozens of abilities that destroy him for attempting to do that. So because of that, Roadhog has two playstyles. He either can spam at range to work down the front line, or he can flank for picks. And the problem with the spam playstyle is that, well, one, Sigma's grasp got buffed, so overly spamming him just gives him more health, but also, two, the spam tanks with shields can spam back at you, and you don't have a shield. So the balance isn't quite there, where Roadhog's weapon isn't enough to outmatch the value that the spam tanks are giving their team in allowing them to look for picks or just build ult charge or whatever, while they're safe behind their own barriers, and Roadhog provides none. So really, Hog gets relegated to having to play off in his own in a very deathmatch pick-oriented playstyle, which I think is pretty cool and something that I think Overwatch should focus more on. We have way too many characters in this game that have been compounding on top of each other to create all of the AoE healing creep and too much teamwork stacked on top of each other, so much so that everyone can just stand near each other and press a button and nobody can die or whatever, right? Like, there's way too much of that play. And that might be a controversial point, but I would like to see more characters that can have a little bit of a self-sustaining playstyle somewhere in the game and make some plays. Hog is the only guy that kind of gets away with that a little bit, but it's so easy to outplay that it's not very good. So let's use him as an example. How could we power creep him into having more interesting interactions, but not be overpowered himself? That's always the tricky part. One example is I think you could just give him more ammo, which would allow him to do more damage all the time, but more specifically have more uptime on shield break. It also would make him pretty scary when he's in the mix brawling it out because he'll have so many extra shots before he has downtime, but I think he needs that type of power to outweigh how little he does for the team otherwise. Other things they could do is reduce his Hook cooldown again to 6 seconds. I don't think that would be too impactful though. I more so think that should just happen regardless almost. The fact is there's just way too many ways to deny a hook. It's way too easy to do. And now with so many escapes, it's not even guaranteed that you'll get the follow-up kill anyway. And then other changes they could do, I discussed this with Flats for giving an SVB on our podcast Group Up on SVB's channel that you can go check out if you want a 3-hour conversation on tank balance. But if they put in some version of the 3-2-1 experiment hog rework where Take a Breather added a durability effect to his team, that would be pretty good. That would give him some team utility that other tanks provide, frankly. I think they could just add that kind of thing in and not be too broken, considering how much you're giving up and how easy it is to interrupt Take a Breather as it is with no shield. But I like enabling the solo playstyle personally, so maybe they would balance towards that instead. Either way, like, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. You need to give these characters that are struggling their version of Steadfast so that they actually can do their job. Over to Lucio, quite simply, I think they could just revert his speed boost nerfs. Because even if they did that, I don't even think he would take over due to how strong Brigitte is still, but might find a gap for him to be usable, at least on some maps. Fine, but I think the best route for the development to go is to try to buff characters into their role, or at least give them some interactions. Another example of this is, it was suggested on the podcast I mentioned, for Winston, for his electric Tesla cannon, to deal extra damage to deployables like Batiste's Immortality Field or Torbjorn's turret. It's this type of MOBA complexity and more rock, paper, scissors that can help characters find a place to have interactions in the game. I thought giving Symmetra infinite ammo when cooking shields is a good example of this, though that kind of went away when shields got reworked, but that was a good one. Torbjorn's rework made him reliable. Junkrat's received continuous buffs. He's about as outrageous as he can be without being overpowered. This is the direction I think they have to go. They have to just lean into the power creep, but also lean into the interactions and complicate the game further, which is something that they originally didn't want to do at the launch of the game. They wanted all the abilities to be very clear and you not have to have so much extra knowledge about the game to know how something's going to interact. But I think for the balance of the game, we need more versions of Torb's Molten Core eating through armor and maybe countering Brig Rally. We need more examples of that. We need more Steadfast in order to counteract all the crowd control creep that rose up over time. They've dabbled in these things, but the more they do it, I think the more interesting the state of the rock, paper, scissors counterplay is. If you don't want to buff Roadhog's ammo capacity, maybe he just does more damage to shields there, right? Like, that's an example of what I mean. A way to give a role to someone. Unfortunately, this goes against a lot of the criticisms that was made in Siegel's famous State of Overwatch video, which was a year or two ago at this point, where he was talking about how he loved the basics of the game and how your play mattered more than your pick back in the day when the game was much simpler. But I just don't see any way back to that version of Overwatch with the complexity that's already been added. They either can make the complex heroes that do a lot of things just bad at high tiers, or they can make the rest of the game more complex to have some interaction with it. The truth is, power creep happens to every game. There's no getting away from it. There's only ways that you can handle it gracefully so that it doesn't ruin the game. I think back to a game like Hearthstone, which mirrors Overwatch in a lot of ways, actually. The start of it, the mechanics were very simple and straightforward. In fact, you almost always wanted to run an aggro deck that would just quickly whittle down your opponent. It's sort of like dive comp, really, where back in the day, dive comp was all about your FPS, aim, and movement, those core mechanics. But Blizzard wanted distinctly to counter that meta with a pick. That's what Brigitte was designed to do, and she effectively did that, but it jumped us into this MOBA era of the game where now counter-pick interactions are just going to be key moving forward. I think that decision has just been made. And the reason why I've kind of changed my opinion on this a bit is because I think the game's fun to play. It's much more complicated and maybe punishing in a way that it wasn't before, but the most important goal that Blizzard always has to stick to is just keeping the game fun. And when all three roles have these incredibly powerful abilities, I think the game both is satisfying the design goals of the game from the dev team themselves, but can also be a fun game for the rest of us. High-level players might be upset, but I think you fix their problems with the format of the game, not necessarily with balance. Because it's not like balance has ever done the trick before, right? It just has given us other things for them to complain about. At some point, everybody hates any given meta. There's no balance state that gets us a meta that everybody likes at the same time. So they need to work on better ways to mix that up in a healthy way rather than expecting balance to solve it anyway. I think a lot of work would be done if you could just vote to pick your map. Map selection in the recent Overwatch League tournaments has had great success in at least letting teams play some of their pocket heroes, so utterly important. And I think it would be best if they focus more on those ideas for Overwatch 2 and moving in the future. Better game mode and map design to promote diversity rather than just forcing it with stats. But that's all I have to say about that. And before we go in the video, I wanted to shout out that we are taking submissions for an upcoming guide video. If you want to get your gameplay on Orisa or Sigma reviewed, you can check out the form link in the description. Fill that out. We're looking for games where you lost but thought you played well. Check in the description for the link to the form and put in your replay code and battle tag, and you might be featured in an upcoming guide video. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos go live. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for Your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.